Hi, Christina. It's so good to have you with us today. As uh, as you know, we've started this series called The Modern Independent, interviewing some phenomenal people and product builders from the A-Team community, as we believe that there are the unsung heroes of the tech industry. People who, at some point in their life, realize that they have a craft that really matter to them and would like to pursue their the skills and what they can build with autonomy, choosing to do things that they care about. And we have the privilege to be speaking with people just like yourself to learn a bit about their life story, their path, their craft, insights, learnings, war stories from what brought you to today. How are you, Christina?
Hi, Raphael. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm doing great. Back in New York.
Excellent. Yeah, New York's fun right now. So, um, starting with your craft. So you have a real interesting way to describe it. Would you mind describing it for a second? What is it you do?
So what I do, I always like to say that I'm a researcher by training and by nature. I'm just a deeply curious person, and especially when it comes to human behavior. And throughout my studies and my forays in the research world, I found a way to actually tie this research capability and then my innate curiosity to a craft, as you say, that solves people's problems, which is really wonderful. I really love when I can, uh, you know, uncover a problem that a certain community is facing and then translate that into a workable digital product solution. So some people call me a UX designer. Um, so yeah, I have a mostly have a focus in the healthcare space, but I've worked on a very wide range of different projects, everything from um, building a chatbot for one of the biggest health systems in New York to working with a small music tech startup on refining their product for their user groups to creating a beautiful website design for this immersive art space in Vegas. So it really keeps things interesting.
All right, that sounds pretty cool. So what's UX research? I understand software development. I understand product management. Um, UX has been something that we've talked about a lot over the past few years, but what does it really mean? And what does it mean to craft new experiences? Can you tell us more about what it actually looks like?
Yeah, so it's really all about process, right? So people a lot of times they think about design and they think of design as like building something beautiful or making something look nice. Design to me really it's where, and one of the more classical definitions of it is where form meets function. And so what I focus on as a UX researcher is really that function piece, right? So I it's my responsibility to inquire to the group that we're focusing on, enter a space with the beginner's mindset, gather the clues that I can, and from the information that I gather through this research process, coming up with a solution that's really going to work for these people, and oftentimes engaging them in the process of building. So part of the UX process too, a lot of it is involved is testing, right? So as we're creating a product, we're asking the people who are out there in the world that are going to be using it, what do you think of this? How is this working for you? We'll observe them even taking a step back and see what's working and what's not, to ensure that we're actually meeting people's needs and not just simply focusing on business or expert goals, which can be reliable but are not the most reliable at all times.
Did you know that that was a job, like growing up? Like how at what point did you like where you're like, oh yeah, that's a job I want to do?
So I was in the academic space. I did a lot of social science and media research, I suppose. And then I did a self-designed graduate degree at Columbia University called Global Thought, where I basically was doing a blend of anthropology and sociology as it relates to media. That's an extremely high level version of it. But anyway, long story short, at Columbia, they had just opened up this design studio there. And one of my mentors at the time was, encouraged me to go get involved in it. He's like, hey, I think you'd really like this. And basically, I decided to go to a couple of their sessions, which were basically introducing you to the design thinking process. And I had this revelation. I was like, oh my goodness, like I don't just have to like sit here in my room doing research or like have just like write papers. I can actually make stuff and put stuff out there in the world. So that really bridged my creative tendencies. And like why I was always like, you know, when I was younger, I was always taking art classes. I like to like use my hands and make stuff. So that was, I found that to be a really wonderful way to bridge the two. And so that's how I ended up in that world. It was like totally unintentional. I really didn't have a clear sense of like of of which direction I could potentially go in. And that was my point of entry into this world.
Oh wow. So are you leveraging some of the studies that you had prior to understanding that that's the world you wanted to be a part of, or was that a completely new discipline you had to kind of learn from scratch?
It's a lot of overlap. So the part that's a discipline that I needed to learn from scratch was definitely like the design side of things, right? Because UX research draws on a lot of techniques and tools from ethnography, and that was something that I had already been practicing. When it came to okay, once you have your research, then what do you do with it, and like how do you shape that into something that uh, you know comes out as an app on your iPhone or a website or a new product feature, right? You know, sometimes this process is used for tangible real world objects, like how do you make a better vacuum cleaner, or like, you know, design a more ergonomic paintbrush, maybe. So that second part of it, when it came to really design and like using design tools and translating insights into workable, actionable solutions, that was the part that I needed to learn from scratch.
Hmm. Does it feed your kind of, you talked about your inclination towards art and making things. Do you feel that at the end of the day, when you solve a UX problem, you mentioned the chatbot, for example, for, was that the Mount Sinai
Yeah.
project? That sounds amazing. I want to ask you a few things about that. But is it really, how much art do you think there is versus kind of a methodical, more scientific approach to kind of solving a problem with user experience versus the more creative side of things? Like, how do these two play, and what's the kind of ratio between them in some way?
Well, it's interesting because I was actually having this conversation the other day about what is creativity, and so when it comes to and my answer to this question was it's I again it's about process, right? So when it comes to the methodology, that's something that's tried and true. Like when we're doing user research, or at least when I'm doing user research, there's these kind of best practices and principles, and there's a lot of that in design as well. But when you're coming up with a solution, are you getting your findings and do you have your insights and then you're going back to the rule book to see what you do in that situation? Or are you coming up with something totally new? Or, you know, something that's new to this sort of problem area, right? And when it's the second one, that's when I find that it's more of this creative process, because there is no rule book to go back to give you what to give you the antidote for whatever problem it is that you've diagnosed.
Hmm. Interesting. So I think that we were talking about, my background has been like writing code at a time where there was no such thing so much as product management and things like that. That came about like a bit later. And UX, I think, was not even a thing. I'm not even sure it was a word. But then it became a thing, and I was working on my first startup, and I realized I was basically doing product management, and a big piece of that was UX. Like we were building a fintech app called BillGuard, and we had to take really complex information and things that are emotionally overwhelming for people, like dealing with their money, and somehow making it super easy, delightful, and satisfying, and kind of giving you this sense of control. So I think one of the things that I realized through that is that it's really unclear what's, like, there are a lot of people that are good at kind of doing this type of things, like building products and figuring out how to build software. But I think it's sometimes pretty hard to figure out what's product management, where does it begin and ends, and where does UX research begins and ends. And I think for organization as well, like smaller organization, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, don't necessarily have UX research as a specific function, but then larger organizations do. So, like, how would you say UX research comes in alongside the other roles that are involved in building a product?
That's a great question. And there's definitely this overlap that you talk about. So I often find myself when I'm working with a smaller team as a contractor, even playing many of these different roles, right? So I mean, very often I also consider myself a designer, so I'll cross over into that design space. Then sometimes there might need to be some product management in that space. So contributing to the definition of what a roadmap looks like and what's the order in which we need to prioritize the features that we're building out, and what does the communication with the developers look like between the designers and I mean, it really kind of just depends on what the team's process is. I think there's, you know, this is I, it's like becoming more of a defined world. I think it's still new enough that we're seeing as time goes on that there's these much more niche and specific roles that are emerging within the field of user experience, whatever blank whatever you call it, architecture, design, research. um so I guess to answer your question, it's like I also can, I'm thinking of an art too. So this is also kind of an art where there's no real certain rule book a lot of the times until for where one begins and another one ends, unless you're with a very well structured organization. And that's speaking from my own experience. I mostly work in like agency type settings, or with new teams and large organizations, or with startups. And when you have that smaller scale with just smaller, leaner teams, it's kind of you almost have an opportunity to get your hands on a little bit of everything at times.
Yeah, we certainly do love small, agile, super smart teams ourselves very much. Um, and so, in your experience, you've been contracting for a while with different organizations. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So, what would love to hear kind of what does that look like, and what type of organization or what type of teams actually to follow up on that point you feel was the most like was the best to work with in terms of the people you work with, the type of organization, etc.
Yeah, so for me personally, and I know all independent workers are different with this, but I really tend to focus on like long-term trusted relationships. So I'd so much rather have a instead of having many different clients, I'd so much rather have uh, you know some really solid business relationships where we co-create value for one another. Um, so that being said, I have work I often subcontract with agencies actually, and that I have a few that I've been working with a little bit longer term, and that type of relationship works really wonderfully for me because you're able to build up the trust and the rapport and work with and feel as if you have a team, right? Because being an independent worker, it can often be isolating when you just kind of are yourself in your little bubble, like checking in with your client every now and then, which happens, of course, and it works through it. But when we're talking about like preference, and what works the best for me is feeling like I have people that I know how they work. They know how I work. We have a good relationship. Our minds meet and are cohesive in terms of our flow and our way of processing ideas. Um, so, and that of course comes with time, communication, all that good stuff. So, for me personally, that's what's worked the best.
Cool. And what's your favorite type of clients or companies to work with that you feel that you can bring the most value and you kind of and you find the work fulfilling?
I love working on projects that involve what I call fundamentals. So basically, like these are the things that I consider necessary to surviving and thriving in this world. And so for me, that's healthcare, education, environment and climate change, the arts for sure, because what is life without a little bit of magic and sparkle and wonder that comes
Yeah, especially now.
Yes,
We need
that
more than
comes with
ever.
that artistic
Yeah.
space. We need artists. That's how movements are made and the grounds are shaken and all that good stuff. But mostly I've worked in the healthcare space. I actually have, so I was talking about my research background before. I have some research background in behavior change. And so if there's a project that I can work on that makes healthcare more accessible and allows people to kind of, live healthier in terms of themselves and their communities and in relation to their communities, that's really what I have found the most fulfilling in the past. And because I have a lot of experience in that industry, it's I feel the most impactful when I have a project that's in that space.
That's pretty great. You like to tackle really big problems that matter. I think you call them the fundamentals. I think I really like that definition. And your expertise is in behavioral change, which one could argue, I certainly would, that it may be the best thing that technology can do.
The worst,
Help what?
or the worst. That's
Or the worst.
that's
Actually, yeah,
what I mean.
you're right.
Did
Absolutely.
you see
Or
the
the
social
worst.
dilemma?
The what? Sorry?
Did you see the social dilemma? It's like this new
It's
film
queued up,
that
but not
yeah,
yet.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. It's just, it's kind of like the prime examples of all of that stuff. But then again, it's like part of the reason why I'm in this space as well. It's like I feel as if I can be a voice in making sure that the behavior change is powerful in the ways that lift all of us up as humans and allow us to contribute the best we can to one another and to this wonderful world that we live in.
Yeah. So, do you deal with this kind of ethical questions? I mean, I've been exposed to that by I mean, there's Nir Eyal, right? Someone
Yeah.
who's been really well known to write the kind of Bible on how to make people addicted to your app, the book Hooked. He actually moved to New York, and he was telling me. Well, actually, he published it. He wrote the book that kind of tips the balance
Mm-hmm.
to the other side, to basically talking about how can you use technology, but without being addicted. Like, how do you solve the addiction from technology? In fact, I'm curious, when you see the state of, so I think we can clearly agree or clearly see that design as a whole for digital products has improved tremendously.
Mm-hmm.
um, would you say the same about UX? Like, when you look around the tools and stuff that you see, do you feel like the level is high? You look at it, you're like, oh my god, there's so many mistakes, so many problems that could be made so much better, and we create unnecessary friction to users, to consumers. How do you view digital products these days?
Well, which kinds? I'm like thinking
I,
of, I'm thinking of like government websites. I'm like,
oh yeah,
some,
well,
some of
government
them
websites, they're still the worst, right? Have they
are,
gotten better over time?
some of them are okay. I don't spend a ton of time on them to be totally honest, but
Okay, maybe that's
um,
the way to deal with that.
but I have, it's like you see a lot of improvements. I think just because it's like there's a lot more reliable information that's more accessible. I think there's a lot more people who are kind of awakened to what user experience really means. And I think that translates to just better design. However, at the same time, I think that there still remains a lot of work to be done on certain apps, websites, etc. So I have kind of a mixed opinion on that.
And
But
yeah, and what,
standards, I'll just add one more thing. I
please?
think the
Yeah.
standards are just much higher.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think so too. I think so too. In a way, it's almost like we can tackle much bigger problems now with better UX, better designs of solutions, that things that used to feel like, you were talking about healthcare. I think there's some companies today that are taking something that's incredibly overwhelming and nerve-wracking sometimes to use. You don't really understand what's going on, to an experience that's like, wow, like you spoke about a chatbot, right? An experience that's like super consumer friendly, super nice. You see what's going on and you feel that you're in control. And that to me is like, it's so fundamental. And then I wonder basically, what would be your advice to companies out there, whether it's startups or mid-sized companies or even large companies? When should they be thinking about bringing on UX research and kind of that type of expertise to their team, to their product?
All the time. I think even if you can't do it, like even if you can't, if you're a small team and you really can't afford to add someone else, if you have even like this 10 minutes to or an hour where you can put your product in front of 5 different people and just get their opinion, that will help, you know, and make and like and approach it with just kind of thoughtful, non-leading questions to really get feedback to on what it is that you're building. Because I think so often when, especially when we're building something new and we're so immersed in our worlds of focused on this one thing that is our creation, and that's like our, almost like for many people it's like a child, right? It's like this beautiful,
I'd agree with that.
yeah,
Yep.
this beautiful force that you're bringing into the world. I think it's really easy to lose sight of what this might look like to other people, and to develop this sort of tunnel vision. So what I think is that, if you have any opportunity, if you're building something new, if you have any opportunity, just put in front of some people who are who are really not involved in your process at all. It can help.
Yeah. Did you feel that it's enough to just know that? Like, okay, now Christina told me I need to show it to other people, and I will. I mean, in fact, I do, but sometimes I feel that I'm not asking the right questions. So, do you, how much of the method can be learned, and what questions would you use to ask people after the experience you work external from with a fresh perspective?
Yeah, so this is interesting, and this is actually one of the trickiest, in my opinion, parts of doing this type of research. I actually work with some design students as well who are doing design boot camps as a mentor, and kind of my two rules of thumb is avoid yes or no questions, and
Oh.
avoid leading questions. And a leading question would be something like, do you think this is user friendly? Does this does where does this make you frustrated, right? Because you're implanting into their head by your question that I'm going to get frustrated by this thing, but maybe it's a totally seamless experience, maybe it's wonderful, right? And
So
so,
what should you ask instead?
tell me about your experience with this using this product. Walk me through your thoughts as you're, if, and I'm talking, this is more about like a usability test, right? So this would come after you have something that exists in the world. um, Please, ask them to complete a task and then say their thought process out loud. So basically, you want story time. And
Mm.
the more a person can share, the better. That comes like truly from with them, without any implanting of ideas based on your question. So just
Well, that's
try.
a really good. Well, that's a really good tip. So I get now the part about not asking leading questions. What about why shouldn't I ask yes no questions?
Because how good is a story when it's just one word?
Okay, all right.
You see what I mean? So when you ask a
Yeah.
yes or no question, it's, you say, okay, it's like it just stops right there.
Okay, all right.
Sometimes it's
So
necessary, right? When you're doing like more of discovery research, which usually comes before you build a product, or if you're working on a new feature like redesign. But when you're sometimes, like, there comes a time where you might need to add a yes or no question, but in that situation I would be prepared to have a follow up of okay, it's almost like a choose your own adventure book. It's like, okay, if you choose yes, where do we go? If you choose no, where do we go? And have something prepared as you're going into that situation.
and what are your thoughts on focus groups for products that don't yet exist? Like a problem that I found with it is, for my non absolute non expert opinion, but the what I found with focus groups is that oftentimes we ask questions that basically require the interviewee to predict their future behavior, and that's something that it's kind of unreliable. So do you believe in those focus groups? Like, are they helpful, and if so, how to run them?
I never use them for
Oh, okay. Why not?
research, because the trouble with focus groups is twofold. One is that people, and this is especially so, I'm giving the healthcare example. That's where I have the greatest body of experience. A lot of times people won't feel comfortable around others sharing certain things about themselves. And I think it's easier to create bond when you're just one-on-one and really focus on someone's comfort level. So like this is something you get with experience is, I might be interviewing someone over video chat like we're speaking now, and I might be able to see something in their face that indicates that they're a little bit uncomfortable or they're a little bit stressed, or embarrassed or whatever it might be. And then I can do certain things to help that person feel a little bit more open, just based on what I'm reading, right? I think it's a little bit harder to do when you have a bigger group of people. The other thing that can happen in focus groups is that the other people who answer can bias someone else's response. So I'm asking a question to a group of 6 people as a focus group moderator, right? And the first person speaks and says something that person number 2 hadn't thought of before, but then decides
Sure.
to
Yeah.
continue with, right? So I may never know what the original immediate gut reaction was to that person. So I
Interesting.
think they serve a purpose. They're often used in marketing. I've used them before with like limited time constraints for product feedback, just like showing screens and stuff like that. People sometimes use them for to get feedback on designs. But I mean, for me and my process and most of the people who are my colleagues and in my business world, it's just not really something that we practice as UX practitioners.
Hmm. Do you believe in any of the kind of online tools for usability testing or UX research, things like that?
I think they're fantastic. I'm someone who has always worked remotely, even before all of the pandemic stuff. And so I think that they're really wonderful when maybe you don't have access to a facility that you can use. Maybe you have to talk to people from all different types of geographic locations, right? So I'm in New York and I want to talk to people from all over the United States and get a mix of that. That's
Any particular tool that you like to use, like usertesting.com, stuff like that, like Google surveys and the like?
So usertesting.com is good. I probably use that one the most. And
Mm-hmm.
then just to get participants, like userinterviews.com is great. They distribute your incentives for you, and that's something where you don't need a third party recruiting.
Hmm.
Um, However, I think, there is something that in-person interviews are also great because there's just so much that happens. I think a lot of us having like these Zoom meetings as a constant in our lives that we can gather, like there's just something that's not quite there. I think also I've read
Sure.
that our brains are actually doing more work to fill in for whatever types of interactions are pixelated. So that's why we kind of get a little exhausted too. So yes, pros and cons, I'd say.
Yeah. And the chatbot with Mount Sinai, was it, so it's very cool that there's a chatbot. Do you feel like that really solved a problem, a UX problem or problem in general? And if
That
so, how?
for sure. So I actually, full disclosure, I was involved in really more of the creation for that. I was hired as a consultant with them to do most of the discovery work and then work with their UX designers to guide what this product would look like. And then once it
Awesome.
launched, I wasn't as in touch anymore. But when it comes to the so when it comes to the chatbot as a solution, I definitely think it does, because a few things that we gathered from the research were that people oftentimes don't have time to wait on the phone with a call center to be on hold and figure out all of their medical stuff. A lot of times people are also calling from work. So when they're calling from work, they might be in their cubicle sitting next to all their colleagues, and they don't want to be talking about their health issue on the phone with the doctor, so it's much easier to type. The other thing that's really wonderful about the chatbot is we also did work with the call center at Mount Sinai. So this is the big room where they call it the access center. This is the big room where everyone works, answering phone calls that are coming in about rebooking appointments, about checking if the insurance is available, about asking for prescription questions. And what we found that I think was probably the most profound solution, that we came up with, was that these people they're like insanely busy and stressed out all the time, which makes people who are calling in unhappy because they have to wait for so long. And they're spending half of the time that they're on these phone calls just verifying information for people. So what we were able to do with the chat bot and the fact that it's a bot, right, it's automated, they were people who were patients could fill in the information and verify themselves with the bot. That information would get shipped over to the people in the access center and cut down their time spent on calls by about half. So they could do the thing that they're actually there to do, which is to give people help and like help guide them to the right place and get them the information they need, versus like, what's your name? What's your date of birth?
The worst.
What
Yeah.
insurance are you on? What's your phone number? What's your address? You know, so that I think was probably the, like I said, I think that was probably the most profound impact of that when it comes to like solutioning. From my knowledge, at least. There may be
Super
more now.
interesting.
This was over a year ago, but there may be more now that's been uncovered. So
Is there, you mentioned at the beginning a bunch of like really amazing, like super inspiring projects that you worked on. And while I wish we had time to go into each and every one of them, is there one in particular that you felt that there was a really interesting UX solve to the solution?
yeah, so I recently worked on a project with a pharmacy that we had to basically the pharmacy workers were very, very stressed out. Again, this is like another healthcare worker stress situation. And there was this inclination that there was something about the pharmacy workflow platform, like the that they use to keep track of the prescriptions that they're filling, that was really causing a lot of stress. So after spending time observing in the pharmacies and then also interviewing with people, we realized that the platform, the way that the interface existed, was creating this false sense of urgency that was basically making everyone go nuts, for lack of a better term. They were thinking they had so much work to do in such a small amount of time, which sometimes was true, but other times it was not. It was like there was plenty of time left in the day, and everyone is still, they're seeing so much information on their screen that they're still running around frantically trying to get all this stuff done. And so our solution to that, basically, I mean, there were many, many things involved that I can't get into for time and other reasons. But basically, the like having that specific of an insight that we could then work from to come up with these solutions, and then like put it in front of people and make them feel really good about what they were seeing and like confident that they could get something, that they could finish the work that they had for the day, um, was something that I found to be
That's
really
amazing.
awesome.
I mean, I love it when we get to build products that you can tell, like tangibly, that you've made someone feel better.
Yeah.
I've done something tangible with and positive to their lives. I love that. That's a great example.
Yeah, and then you
Uh,
also think about like the second order effects of that, right? So it's like I'm working in a pharmacy and I feel so much better about my day. So when a customer comes in and I'm talking to them, they'll feel better speaking to me because I'm
right.
just like
That's
I'm
very
here and I'm
interesting.
yeah. So
So like make one person feel better, you have no idea like how
right,
much
so your
ripple effect
your
it's going to
impact
have.
becomes exponential.
You spoke a little bit about working with other agencies and kind of going into longer term relationship with projects. Is that how do you see basically that type of work moving forward? Would you like to at some point be a part of a company? Or you actually really enjoy the life that where you get to choose? You mentioned being remote. Would love to hear about how you came into that and how you see the future.
So I came into it totally by accident. Um, or unintentionally, I will say. I was at a my I've actually always worked for myself. So
Wow.
I my first job, it was a research role that I obtained because I was at a conference. This was when I was finishing like my academic career, and I was chatting with one of the people there who I had met over the course of the few days of the conference, and he was like, I think my company has a project for you. And interestingly enough, I was doing research that was kind of like user research. It was like a little bit like on the edge of just like marketing, just general research about the future of work and like the tendency for people to work more remote while I was working remotely and for myself. And it was like, the gig economy is coming up. And, this was years ago before this was like all over the place. And I was like, I love this. And I never want to do anything differently. Like, I mean, differently is, a broad term, but like I was like, I definitely want to continue working for myself. There's so much um, to gather and grow from there when you're working independently. Like, I think there's a lot more, at least for me, there's been a lot more um, opportunity to leap to getting more responsibility instead of like going up rungs, which often happens
Interesting.
internally in companies. Um, and yeah, I just continued doing it. It was a bit of a struggle in the beginning. I was working lots of other random jobs to get myself started, giving wine tastings, um, which was I learned a lot there and drank a lot of wine there. But it was
That's
it was lots of fun in the process. And then finally I was in a position where I just had a solid workflow coming in, and it's definitely something I hope to continue, and perhaps pivot in some ways. The other really wonderful thing about working independently is that I because I do have control over my schedule, or a little bit more autonomy in terms of my schedule. I have an opportunity to work on some other passion projects, so which is something that's very important to me because I've never
anyone you could share?
um yeah, so well,
Exciting.
I have two. So I'm like really into, there's this whole world of speculative design, which is basically about, I don't know if you're familiar with it at all, but it's basically about like world building and using speculative fiction to start from the future and work backwards for solutions. So one of my
Ooh,
ways of playing with
I
that,
love that. I didn't know about this, but I love
yeah,
it.
look it up. Google has a big practice. I can like send you some stuff later of
Please do.
different organizations and
We'll definitely link to them. Yep.
yeah, that I'm tapped into. So that's one of them. And then another one, and this one can be a little esoteric. Um, so I'm really, as you know, I'm like very passionate about like what I call these fundamentals, and really working on the things that are going to help us not just survive in the world, but also thrive in it, and also help the world around us, which involves the world around us thriving. And so I'm actually have been noodling on some sort of new framework that goes beyond human-centered design to encompass how can we create products, systems that optimize for the well-being of the most amount of creatures on Earth. So it's like I said, it's a little esoteric.
So creature-centered design, so not just for human beings.
Yeah,
Is
not
that
just
what
for
you're
human
saying?
beings, because I think a lot of the reason
Ooh.
why, I mean, human-centered design is wonderful. I think it serves a very, very important role in the world. At the same time, I think a lot of the reason why we're facing a lot of the climate issues that we are, a lot of the political issues that we are, a lot of the issues that we're seeing with, some of these really addictive technologies that we are, um, is because we are so focused on humans, because we see ourselves as these entities that are
That's very interesting.
completely independent and isolated and somehow mightier than the rest of the world, when really like we depend on so much on this planet. And so I think like when it comes to really creating systemic change, there needs to be some other sort of process and framework for looking at the types of problems that we want to solve.
I'm just uh, incredibly grateful to see how you look at communication, behavior, what you call the fundamentals, experience, both in the very micro and specific on how to solve a particular problem that a pharmacy may have or a hospital may have, but also at a kind of grander, almost like universal level on how it connects the different beings that surround us. I'm incredibly grateful for these insights and those thoughts. Excited for your passion projects, excited for the next thing going to solve. And thank you very much for spending this time sharing those fascinating ideas and thoughts and processes.
Thank you so much. It's been such a delight to speak with you.